All right, well, thank you for joining me today. I have Levi Sauerbrei here with Nerd Butler and Eve Mayer Media, and he does consulting for a number of different digital media companies, digital marketing companies, mostly from the IT side of things. And he's been working in the IT world for a long time. We'll just kind of leave it with that. And right now we see a lot of conversations of how do we move to kind of the remote work model. And that's something that I know Levi has been assisting businesses with, particularly small to medium-sized businesses for years and years and years. So I wanted to talk to him today and get some of his perspective on the world as it is right now, but also, how can we adapt to this changing workplace? So welcome, Levi.
Thanks. I hope I have sage and brilliant things to say, but if I can just repeat the correct answers from somewhere else, I'll be happy with that.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do now.
Sure. So when I was a wee tadpole right out of high school, I joined the Air Force and learned how to fix air traffic control radios and police and first responder radio systems. Got out of the military and did that as a living for a little while, and then went to school. I was an electrical engineering major for a little while. Then I was computer science, and then I was psychology, which was actually a lot more interesting. I finally ended up with an IT degree and went out into the corporate world where I had a business analyst role, data analyst role. This is back before, I'll put in quotes, big data. So data analyst was really a spreadsheet jockey who knew how to make pivot tables. And then I moved on from there to a bunch of other things. I've been an IT director for a national nonprofit. I was a database administrator for a variety of arts and culture organizations, working on their CRM. And then most recently, the last 5 or 6 years, I've been with my wife, we owned a marketing agency for a while. We sold that a few years ago, and now we just do independent consulting. So I'm still working in digital media about half the time, and the other half of the time I'm working as a database consultant.
But with a public media company, right?
Yeah, we're working with KERA here in Dallas. So, what is digital and what is media and what is content and what is data? Like it all, at some point after a while, it all just kind of mushes together. The more I know about you, the better the messaging is. Blah, 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 blah. But like the lines between all of those disciplines has absolutely disappeared in the last 7 or 8 years.
So we've been talking a lot about remote workplaces right now and what that is. Can you tell me what is a remote workplace?
Sure. So to me, a workplace is a set of tools that allow you to do your job. And traditionally that's been all within an office building, but a remote workplace is simply wherever you have to be to do your job that isn't the office. So it's a set of tools more than a location, right? So when we think about remote, one of those tools is internet access, obviously. But other of those tools are, can I just do the tasks required by my job? And if those tasks are attend meetings, do I have a tool that allows me to attend meetings? If my task is creating graphics or creating video, if it's editing a podcast, do I have the tools I need, both hardware and software, at the location I'm currently in to do my job? So a remote workplace can be very broad in definition. Up until 2 weeks ago, when we talked about a remote workplace, we meant like somebody living in a van and like sitting outside of Starbucks and shooting video, or somebody who was traveling the world out of a backpack and they were remote workers. Obviously, in the last 2 weeks, we have come to a point where remote work means everybody except for the people that just can't afford to not be in the building. So it's changed a lot, but the definition remains the same, which is a collection of tools that lets you do your job.
So from someone who's just starting, thinking about the remote workplace, because we obviously on campus have moved to remote teaching, but I'm trying to work that into the curriculum to not only say, okay, well, if we're going to do remote teaching, how can we learn about how to be remote workers as part of that? Because everything's going to change at least a little. And once people have kind of seen how this works, the new normal is going to probably include a little bit more remote working, maybe. or not,
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
what everybody sees comes out of this. So, in your opinion, what are the pros and cons on both sides of doing remote work?
Sure. I think I don't have a lot of cons. There are a couple, I suppose. We'll do the pros first. Um, I think the pros of remote work from an employee standpoint is that you can create an environment, or you can try to create an environment that is most conducive for you. One of the greatest burdens of working in a physical office with a large number of other people is that if somebody listens to music all day long and doesn't have headphones, and you need a silent environment, it doesn't work. Conversely, if you need noise in the environment to be really effective and to concentrate, and there's none in the workplace, that's also counterproductive. So the pros of it are you can set up your own environment. If I need a white noise generator, if I listen to death metal all day and that's how I soothe my mind and allow me to do what I need to do. So setting up your own circumstance is one big advantage. I think the other big advantage is, I no longer have a 30-minute commute in each direction. That's an hour a day I have back in my life. Now, I might choose to spend that as a productive employee. I might choose to spend that on mental health time. But either way, that makes me a happier, more productive worker. Um, as a boss or as a business owner, I think the advantages are lower overhead costs. And again, we're talking about in a normal situation, right? Nothing about this situation is normal, but allowing your employees to work remotely, if you do it on a full-time basis, can reduce your overhead significantly, right? You don't need as much office space. You don't need you don't need to buy as much furniture, all of these things. The cons are there is a community and culture aspect to building an effective team. It absolutely can be replicated virtually, but at the moment, I don't think, certainly generationally, older generations don't have a concept of how to do that. I think younger generations have a concept of how to do that socially, but we haven't really ported that over into a professional environment yet. And I'm really interested to see, a year from now, to your point, what behaviors we've adopted from this experience that we carry forward. Um, Everybody's going to be on a Zoom call in the next 6 weeks. And so the exposure to that social etiquette is going to broaden out quite a bit beyond people that are used to doing, social media for themselves or just FaceTiming with friends.
I think one of the challenges that we certainly do encounter, particularly with um, younger workers or people coming into the workforce as well, like think about having an intern as a remote worker, right? Like there
Mm-hmm.
might be some inherent challenges in how we do training. There's certainly going to be a learning curve for us as people managers with how we do that, because imagine yourself is new to the market and you have a bunch of questions and there's not somebody you can just kind of peek around the corner and knock on their door and ask them, or run into them in the hallway and pick their brain. I mean, that's how lots of us have learned for years and years and years. And so I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is finding ways to appropriately find that balance of how do we troubleshoot for ourselves? Like
Yeah.
I say, we like younger workers entering the job force, how do they troubleshoot for themselves, and how do they also get comfortable asking for help appropriately?
And
Uh,
how do you foster those informal mentorships that evolve because you happen to be sitting next to a senior engineer, and maybe you're sitting there by design because your boss thought that was a good idea, but it wasn't supposed to be a formal arrangement. But that level of, I think, for sort of mid-career folks and even senior level folks, we kind of know our knitting, right? Like we know what our job is, and we need the energy of the crew, but we don't need it to evolve professionally as much. But we do need to be reaching out to the younger entry level workers and saying, hey, I know we're not going to go get coffee because you're in California and I'm in Jersey, but we should just take 30 minutes sometime this week and just have have a Zoom call for no other reason than just to like pick each other's brains, see what's going on. What have you learned in college that I don't know because I've been out of college for so long? And what do you need to know about how the company runs?
Yeah, I think that's great. And so with that, knowing that there are inherent challenges with kind of learning the business, and honestly, maybe having too much freedom at times when you're first kind of learning there, what are behaviors or any kind of pieces of advice that you might give to younger people who are learning how to be remote workers, with how to just be diligent in actually accomplishing tasks.
Yeah, I think, and there was something else I was going to mention in cons, which actually fits in right here, which is it becomes increasingly easy to blur the line between your work life and your personal life. And I think that applies to this as well. It's really important for your own productivity and for your own sanity to draw some pretty clear lines between when you're working and when you're not. Um, if you have the space for it, set up a separate space that is just for work. If you're doing personal email, do it somewhere else. A lot of people don't have that kind of space. I actually read an article yesterday. Um, it was a really good piece from a guy who is in a really small apartment with his wife and two small children. And his office for the day is the kitchen table. Well, obviously that can't persist through dinner. So his workspace is a Chromebook with an external second monitor and a nice little laptop stand and a keyboard and mouse. And when 5 o'clock comes around or whenever he's done working, he puts all of that back into a backpack and puts the backpack in the closet. And then that space becomes the kitchen again. And being really deliberate about that division. And a lot of these are, you probably heard before, but like, get up and put on clothes, shave. Like I don't shave a lot to begin with, but I make sure now that I do, that I don't let myself get like a 5-day growth, because A, it looks hideous, and B, shaving reminds myself I do it at the same time I used to do it. Shave in the morning. Oh, I'm at work today. I would never shave on the weekend. So having routines that trigger your brain to, I'm in work mode now, I'm in personal mode now, is super important. It just, you'll be amazed at how easily you can look up, it'll be 8:30 at night and you're still answering work emails and you're still trying to get that thing done. You have to take care of yourself or you're not going to be a good employee.
Yeah, and I think to that the other side is making sure that when you are working, that you're working. I got a piece of advice one time from a warehouse manager, which is weird that I got, advice that I apply now in teaching and in advertising from a warehouse manager, but it was so simple. He said, plan your work and work your plan. And I know that that doesn't always work. You can't always do that. But I do know there are a certain number of hours that I have in the morning when everybody else is asleep that I can work uninterrupted. And so whether it's Monday morning or Sunday night, whenever I'm trying to plan out the things I know I need to get done, I say, okay, for that hour, that's what I'm working on. And I try to make sure that I stay focused on that. Because I think one of the other things that's a challenge is that when you have so much freedom, it's easy to think of everything else you need to do. Oh, I,
Oh
I,
yeah.
I can't do work until I wash the dishes, or I
Yeah. And I think that is, it's very critical. The other thing I think this is much easier for younger people who haven't been in the workforce as long than it is for, like, I'm a grandfather, the workday is 8 to 5. And we've just been conditioned to that. Well, I am super productive from about 9 to noon. And then from about 12:30 to 3, I can't do squat. And then I kind of catch a second wind around 7 p.m. So whatever your other life responsibilities are going to have to work into this. But 8 to 5, depending on your job, but 8 to 5 doesn't have to be the workday. Like, figure out when you're the most productive. And if you're not an hourly employee, but if you're like a task-based employee, I get paid per piece or I get paid per project. Um, Learn your own rhythms and work when it makes the most sense to work. Don't try and force an all-nighter because you're behind. Like, set up a schedule. If you wake up at 4 in the morning and you are just perfectly clear and sharp and ready to go, have that cup of coffee and get after it. And at 8 in the morning, you've worked half a day, and give yourself permission at 8 a.m. to take lunch. Meanwhile, everybody else is just waking up and coming online, and they're going to try and drag you back into their early morning routine. You don't have to. So draw those lines about your schedule that make the most sense.
Yeah, I think that's great. So with that, that actually ties into another question that I had for you, and that is something I've talked to you and your wife Eve about before. How does the remote workplace actually promote diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, and this is something that Eve in particular has been really fired up about lately, because she just finished her diversity and inclusion certificate from Yale, which is like a 3-week certificate course. It was really interesting. I shoulder surfed most of it. Eve tackles this problem as one not of diversity is not a problem of race or gender or ethnicity, although all of those things are components. But what about differently abled people? What about people who are not geographically available? So diversity can mean a lot of things. You're a morning person, you're an evening person, you're outgoing, you're an introvert. So I do think that a remote work allows for more types of people to enter an organization, because you're not restricted by geography. You're not restricted by some of the other things that have traditionally limited or made an organization more monolithic. So geography and diversity go together. If you live in a town, I graduated high school in a town that had a 2% total minority population. Diversity there didn't exist. You couldn't find it if you tried. If someone had a remote workplace and they were able to hire from New York and Montana and Hawaii and Alaska and Texas and Mexico and Honduras, you have a diverse workforce, and hopefully you're hiring for skills and cultural fit within the company. But it absolutely can affect that, if only because you've removed a geographic boundary, which inherently removes some monolithic demographics in places.
So
I'm sorry, I'll tack one more on there because
okay.
it gets overlooked a lot. Lots and lots of studies about the pay difference between men and women. And one of the theories that's been proposed for that is because women often, not all of them, but enough of them, take off sort of mid-career prime years to start a family. One of the things remote work facilitates is they can work comfortably further into their pregnancy. They can work from home while they're committed to raising that child in a more active manner for the first couple of years. So remote work also can foster diversity in the fact that you've got more women in the workplace as well, simply because it affords them the opportunity, if they choose to work while they're also being crib-side for the first couple of years of their kids' lives.
Never really thought about that.
If you're breastfeeding, it's a massive difference
Right.
in the kind of relationship you have both with your employer and your child. So as opposed to coming to work and having to pump every day, which I've heard the stories and it's not exciting. If you're home doing that and you can still execute your daily duties as an employee, you're going to bring more value to the company because you're already trained, and you're going to have a better family experience because you're there with your newborn.
As we kind of shift into what we kind of refer to our new normal now, I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that change and things like that. With people who are young entering the workforce, what are pieces that you think work well remotely, and what are things that you think they absolutely still need to be in the brick and mortar location to get the true benefit of? Like if we're creating a model where there's this dichotomy where they can get a piece of both, what are the things that work best in each scenario?
Man, I'm at the moment, I'm hard pressed to come up with something that I think absolutely has to be done in person. I do think that there is a generation of management and business owners that are only going to be able to do certain things in person. Um, I think that there's always going to be a role for, whether it's once a year, once a quarter, once a month, once a week, for a team to come together physically whenever possible. But there are lots of teams that were already completely distributed anyway. So that's why I say, like, I have one in mind in particular, and it's the CRM vendor that I've worked with for not 20, 15 years now, 10 years. They've been virtual for 20 years, 100% virtual for 100% of the last 20 years. And they come together as a complete team. They're about 300 employees now, twice a year. Once for the conference that all of the users come to, and once for their own annual retreat. And the rest of the year, they are not there. There was a really good post from their president on LinkedIn, just talking about some of the things they've learned in the last 20 years of being virtual. And he, almost everything can be recreated in some fashion. So they have a virtual water cooler, which is quite literally a Slack channel where anything goes as long as it's office appropriate, right? everybody who works there has pretty much worked in a real workplace, so they know what not to say when the boss is standing right behind them. But they have a virtual water cooler where they can put up pictures of puppies and, you know, their honeymoon trip or whatever it is. And the other thing that they talked about that I found really interesting was that their younger generation of employees, so they've been around long enough now that there's a new wave coming in. It was their younger employees that insisted on video. The stalwarts, the people who'd been there for a while, were like, we don't need video, it's not important, we have Slack, we have email, we've got all these things, Trello boards. But video is the thing that really has solidified that organization as they grew from 30 people to 300. And the larger your organization is, the more important it is to plan for this stuff. So I don't think there's anything that has to be done with physical proximity. I do think doing some things virtually requires a lot more forethought and a lot more understanding of how group dynamics work. Because when groups are physically together, all of our DNA, all of our previous experience lends itself to reading body language, reading in a room. They talk about some people can read a room. Like, that all works really well when you're in person. But if I'm in a video conference with 8 people, how many of them are clearly doing something else and how many of them aren't? And so there's a different kind of etiquette and a different kind of skill to read a digital room than a real one.
It's interesting. Well, kind of final question is just a wrap up. Are there any final thoughts or any tips that you can give, particularly students or young professionals entering the job market, of how to be better employees or be more successful in kind of a remote working model?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is communication. Communication with your direct supervisor, communication with anybody in the organization or client that you interact with, and over communication is never a bad thing. Have your video conference, follow up with an email, be in a chat group, and if the decision is made in that Slack channel or in that chat room, follow up with an email. Schedule a video conference for the least little thing. Like, talking to someone face to face like we are is so much faster and resolves things so much more quickly. Be super, super clear with your direct supervisor. Make sure you and your supervisor have the same set of expectations. If you tell your boss, I'm going to work from 8 to noon and 4 to midnight, that's a lot of hours. If I'm going to work from 8 to noon and 8 p.m. to midnight, and that's what I'm going to do every day, and you're going to get 8 hours of work out of me, and it's going to be good work, don't screw with that. Or if you need to change your schedule one day, don't just assume that because your boss can't see you because he's not in the office, that he doesn't care that you got up in the middle of hours you're normally there and went and did something else. Make sure you communicate. So, hey boss, I got to step out. I got to step away from my desk for an hour to pick up my kid or to whatever it is, but over communicate those types of things, because not being physically present in the building with somebody breeds a lot of insecurity in a certain type of manager. And it just grows and grows until they assume that you are loafing 100% of the time, even though you're still producing the same amount of work. So have a check-in every day with the important people you interact with, whether that's your boss or a client or something, like, even if it's just an email, but preferably it would be a 5-minute call like this at a set time every day. How's it going today? What are you working on? What'd you do with your wife last night? Just have that human interaction, even though you're not physically there.
And I'll say counter to that, like the other perspective with that is also having the flexibility to meet the company needs. I've been in scenarios where people have said, okay, these are the hours I'm going to work. Well, it's like, well, okay, that means that everybody's always in a waiting cycle for somebody else because everybody is on opposite hours. So finding, even if you have hours, you're most productive, finding those hours of overlap with other people to make sure that, if we're working opposite hours, nothing happens very efficiently because one of us is always waiting on something from the other one.
Yeah, and I've done business with companies in Australia before, and there's like a 2-hour window where it makes sense for everyone to speak, and you have to take advantage of that. One of the things that I think that helps with that, and it depends on the industry and it depends on what your role is. If you're monitoring a breaking news desk, that's different than if you're doing graphics for a project that's due in a week and a half. But we've gotten so used to synchronous communication. We think of email as synchronous, right? You send me an email, I get it, I read it, I send it back. But asynchronous ways of communicating, and I think Trello is the best example that most people have probably interacted with, but some kind of project management tool or help desk system or a Trello board that is asynchronous, so everyone can be working sort of at their own schedule, and moving things along. Then when the next person comes in, they can just pick it up and go, and not having to wait for that touch base or that catch up once a day. I think there's going to be a lot of research and science lent to these things in the way that we've seen with regular workplace psychology for years and years. I think within a couple of years, we're going to have major studies about the productivity of remote workers versus in person.
Well, and last question to wrap that up. I know we talked about young professionals and things that they can do to kind of set themselves up for success. What about like freshmen and sophomore who are in college who are now adapting to, I mean, they're familiar with this type of communication because they've
Sure.
done it socially, but what are shifts in behavior that they can do to find success in kind of this new remote world?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an old man, but monitor your social media a little bit. There's still a lot of hiring managers that are going to look at that and judge you in a way that like the next generation won't judge you. So pay attention to it. It doesn't have to be perfect. The other thing that I am really big on is trying to, this is going to sound contradictory, but trying to integrate and separate my personal technology from my professional technology. So what I mean by that is I have a personal Gmail account, and then our whole operation runs on G Suite. All of that email funnels into a single inbox for me, but it's all labeled. So this is a personal email. This is for this brand and that brand. And I have a bunch of tools like LastPass that I use for password management, where I have both my personal and my professional account linked together. And the tools are built for this, right? So if I ever leave my employer, I can sever the link between my personal passwords and my professional passwords. But in the same way that you're probably friends with your coworkers, like get your technology sort of all in the same sphere. I think that I haven't fully formed this theory yet, but there's something about having a single funnel of information coming to you and not being distracted by multiple channels at once that I think makes for a more peaceful existence.
Well, and I could see that for sure because I know that there's some people that I'll have email conversations with, and you and I have most of our communication through LinkedIn, even though we
Mhm.
have each other's phone number. And then
Right.
there's some people, and if I go to LinkedIn, well, maybe I see an update, and maybe I get stuck there for 15 minutes, and then I forget why I was
Yep.
there in the first place. And so, I think the one of the additional values in what you're talking about is just workflow of being able
Mhm.
to kind of focus on that. The other thing with that is I think that as a remote worker, plan your social media time. And I
Yeah.
know that sounds really odd because social media is supposed to be like in the moment. But it's really easy to go down a rabbit hole, particularly when you have a deadline and you're easily distracted, where you just lose an hour and not
Yeah.
on anything, right? And so when in a remote space, like schedule your social media time as well. I'm not saying cut it out, but
Yeah.
if it's free form, before you know it, you've spent 7 hours on your phone on average on a day. And
Yeah.
how many hours did you work a day?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, and I just realized as I'm looking at all the tabs on my browser, my screens are about this wide, which is lovely. But one of the things I realize is like when I'm sitting at my desk, I actually never look at my phone. So in addition to like I combine my emails so that I don't have to feel an urge to flip over to my personal email and see if something important has happened in my personal life. It's all in the same inbox in the same way. And this is really easy with Apple. There are absolutely ways to do it with Android, but my text messages come to my computer. Um, Basically, anything I might need to be alerted about will come to this channel, which is my desktop setup or my laptop if I'm using that. And the ability to work knowing I will be notified if something happens without having to continually pick up my phone and check it and check it and check it allows me to stay in a groove when I'm trying to get work done that otherwise it takes me 30 minutes to get into a work zone. and I can be yanked out of it in 2 minutes. So having all of my channels as consolidated as possible is really, really helpful.
Well, and I think with that also knowing that, and most of the time there's not going to be emergencies that can't wait an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so being able to disconnect. I did an interview with Chris Smith, who's a creative director at the Richards Group, earlier this week, and he said that when he does a lot of his writing, he does it pen and paper because
Mm-hmm.
it's the create. He's not trying to edit and create at the same time, but with that, has silence and have interaction with those other things for that exact reason that it helps him keep that pace and not get
Yeah.
kind of disengaged. So I think that's the other thing is there's a method that it's called, but just taking an hour and saying, okay, no distractions. I'm focusing on this thing and I'm going to get it done. And maybe that's writing or maybe that's reading or whatever that is. But, even if you have everything funneling to one place, knowing when to break away from it because too many things happening at once can, um, distract you from doing anything.
Yep. And if you are a remote worker most of the time, I think it's also really critical for you to seek out feedback and also to be, this is Eve's line, but be kind to yourself, but seek out feedback constantly. It's not a burden. Like, that is the one thing that is completely absent if you work by yourself all the time, is some sort of positive reinforcement. So seek that out from your colleagues, seek that out from your managers. Um, we need that professionally and personally, but especially professionally, we need to know we're doing a good job, and not being fired each day is probably not the best indicator of doing a good job.
Well, my feedback for you is that you are awesome and I appreciate you and your time. And thank you for hanging out with me today and sharing some insights. Any final words of closing?
I think that's it, man. If you're not using a password manager, use a password manager. This is my plea to everyone.
Yeah, I've started using LastPass on Levi's recommendation. Heard him mention it a few times here, but it's pretty handy. It really is.
And yeah, any of you who are going to do client work where they're giving you access to their resources, man, just save yourself the liability and the headache and start using LastPass and ask them to give it to you that way. It will be okay.
Well, all right. Well, thank you so much for hanging out, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
You too. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.